To recap the demo from lecture, remember we built this little clickbait counter app where we could click on either of these two buttons, add to our counter, and then hit this cash out button here that would display the number of money emojis that corresponded with the number that we got to. So to recap how we did that, remember we had a bunch of methods here that dealt with the actual counting, and we broke out the logic of our counting into this counter file here. And remember, this is known as a model. So you want to move as much logic as you can to a model class. So in this case, that'll keep the count. It'll have functionality for adding to the count and for resetting the count. The model should be completely independent of any other part of your app. You should be able to create a completely new counter app with a completely new interface and throw this model in, and it should work the same way. Our counter view controller created an instance of this model here and used this model to add to our counter, to reset the counter when we cashed out, and to actually update the view by rechanging the counter label.text to whatever counter's count is. We also made this a multi-view app, meaning that in our storyboard, we actually have two view controllers here. And remember, we create another view controller simply by going to our object library, looking at view controller, and dragging one of these onto the screen. When you have a new view controller on the screen, you can create a segue to that view controller, which is essentially a way to transition from one view controller to another by going on your first view controller, selecting this little yellow icon here. See if I can zoom in right here. And you control drag, just like you're making an outlet, from this yellow icon over to the view controller that you want to go to. This will give you a bunch of options. 99.9% of the time, you're going to be using show. So just click show, and this arrow will pop up here. This arrow represents our segue. If we click on this arrow or click the segue in the navigator over here, we should be able to get some options in our inspectors. Going to the attributes inspector, you're always going to want to set an identifier for your segue. And this is how we're going to actually reference this segue in code. In this case, we've chosen show cash out segue as our identifier. If we go back to the counter view controller, we can see that when the cash out button is pressed, we call this function perform segue with identifier show cash out segue. And the sender value is an optional. You don't have to put anything in it. In this case, we just put self. This perform segue does some magic behind the scenes where it instantiates a new instance of your new view controller and checks for certain setup properties. When it's ready to actually transition from one view controller to the next, it automatically will call this prepare for segue function. In order to get this to actually do anything, you're going to need to override it and add your own functionality to it. And there's a couple things that you're going to need to do to actually prepare to segue to this new view controller. If you have multiple segues to the same view controller, you're going to need to check what the identifier is just to make sure that you're going through the right segue. Otherwise, you might have multiple identifiers that are going to the same view controller, and you're going to need to identify which one's which. In this case, and in many cases in your iOS development career, you might only have one segue to a certain view controller. Therefore, we actually don't need most of this code here. So we can go ahead and delete that and delete this extra bracket. We can go ahead and unindent all of this. This is really all you need to actually segue to a new view controller. We're going to need to optionally cast segue.destination as an instance of cash out view controller, which if we remember is the view controller that this view controller corresponds to. We set this equal to cash out view controller in our identity inspector, and cash out view controller is another file here. If you remember creating a new class that subclasses UI view controller, we can do that by hitting File, New File, and we choose Cocoa Touch class for creating a model file that's not of subclass of some type of UI view. We'll use Swift file. So Swift file for models, Cocoa Touch classes for view controllers. So back to the counter view controller. Once again, we're casting our destination as a type cache out view controller. We know that that's where our segue is going to go to. Then we actually set a property of this view controller that we're going to. So if we look in cache out view controller, we have a property called count to display. It starts out at 0. And in our viewDidLoad function, we're going to set our cache out label, which is the label that displays our money signs, equal to a string that's just a bunch of repeating money signs. And the count that we're going to repeat to is count to display. This is just a default initializer of the string class. So you might notice it kind of looks like we did an extra step here. We set the value of a variable and then set our labels text in the viewDidLoad function. Why can't we just set the labels text right away from our counter view controller? Well, let's try that out and see what happens. If we just comment out this line, and instead of setting this count to display integer, let's try to set the cache out label dot text equal to, and in this case, instead of the string repeating, just because I'm lazy, let's do just counter.count. And let's go ahead and run this. Now we have our clickbait counter here. We can go ahead and add some stuff. We hit cache out, and all of a sudden we get this huge SIG-abort error. If we open up the debugger here, we can see it unexpectedly found nil while implicitly unwrapping an optional value. So what does that mean? If we go back to our navigator here, go back to the cache out view controller, we can see that cache out label, which again is an outlet, is actually a special type called an implicitly unwrapped optional. These basically have an exclamation point after the type declaration, and while they are optionals, they can equal nil. Every time you access them, Swift automatically unwraps it for you. So you can treat it like it's not an optional, but if this ever equals nil when you access it, then you'll get an unexpectedly found nil error. You might recognize this syntax is similar to like the force unwrapping syntax, and that's because the risks are also similar. If you try to access this too early like we did, your whole app will crash. So you might be asking, when does cache out label actually not equal nil? Well, it turns out right before viewDidLoad, there's another method called loadView, and in that loadView method, the view controller automatically instantiates all of the outlets that you have, as well as all the other subviews that you might have as well. So we can't actually access and set properties of our label until we hit this viewDidLoad function. Now we can set cacheOutLabel.text, knowing that cacheOutLabel will actually be an instance of UI label and not equal to nil. What this means for us is that whenever we're trying to pass data from one view controller to another, we'll need to set some type of property, be it a model class, an integer in this case, or something else. We'll need to set that property first, and in the viewDidLoad function, actually set the labels or any other UI elements to reflect whatever we set that property to. So that's all for this demo. You'll get more practice with passing data between view controllers in the Image Picker lab.